Today's passage is a big one. Not as long as some of the ones that we've had in recent weeks, but in terms of gravitas, this passage is big. Perhaps the biggest we'll come across in this whole series. Surely the climax of the stories and our series would be at the end, right? Well, if you remember back to week 1, I mentioned that the end of Mark's gospel is somewhat contested and controversial because it seems to biblical scholars that someone else wrote the final verses and the original author stopped without seemingly finishing the story. At verse 8, so they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. No resurrection appearance, no commissioning, no ascension. They all happen in the following verses, which biblical scholarship suggests is in a different hand to the original author. And the oldest manuscripts that we have don't have those verses included. But in ancient texts, to find out the main point of the story, you didn't go to the end. You went to the middle. And today's passage is, you guessed it, the literary midpoint of Mark's gospel. So regardless of how those final verses got there and the significance of what was included or excluded, Mark leaves us in no doubt about the main point and what will happen at the end. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. This is the gospel, the good news, the big point, the main point, the only point. And consistent with ancient literary techniques, Mark leads us to this revelation in the first half and then helps us more fully understand this revelation in the second half. So don't panic, there's plenty of good stuff to come in the next 5 weeks of our series. Today's theme is Messiah. And to fully grasp the weight of Mark's main point, it is important to wrestle with this term and what it means, and maybe what it doesn't mean. As I was reflecting on today's passage and the theme, I asked myself the question, what did Peter mean when he called Jesus the Messiah? He obviously got the understanding wrong because he gets reprimanded a few moments later for rejecting Jesus' explanation of his mission. Peter gets the title right, it seems, but gets the understanding of that title woefully wrong. So what then did Peter mean by calling Jesus Messiah? I went to my trusty Bible dictionary. This is actually only one of 6 volumes, by the way. And I looked up the word Messiah. As I did, awesome, pages upon pages of detail about how the word Messiah was understood. But I wanted to particularly focus on the sources outside of the New Testament to get inside Peter's head and try and understand what he understood by using the term. And after some very heavy reading, I found a nice, concise summary in the last section, which read, "The term Messiah is not found very often in the Hebrew Bible and in Jewish writings of the period 200 BC and AD 100. Oh, it seems that Messiah meant different things to different people at different times. Words can and do change their meaning over time and change in context. The root of the Hebrew word simply means anointed one, but that could refer to a number of people and situations at different times throughout Israel's history, but rarely to some sense of future or promised person. But can't we look throughout the Old Testament and see Jesus promised, prophesied, and foretold? Yes, we can, of course. But that's so much easier to see having the benefit of this side of the resurrection. To Peter and to people who encountered Jesus, they were unlikely to be able to draw those connections. We most fully understand the Old Testament when we most fully understand God most fully revealed in Jesus. Peter was still coming to that understanding. To get a sense for what Peter must have thought, we need to consider the location. The region around Caesarea Philippi represented the northern tip of Israel. Emperor Augustus had given the city Panion, named after the Greek god Pan, to Herod the Great. Herod's son Philip rebuilt it and named it after the emperor and himself. And in Jesus' time, there was a temple to Caesar in Caesarea Philippi. So, imagine this setting. Jesus is standing with his disciples at the edge of the promised land, the land God promised to the chosen people of Israel, looking out onto a city that is built in honour and worship to a foreign power and its collaborators, enough to make a Jewish nationalist's blood boil. In the same way that today we are crying out for a cure, a vaccine, a solution to the end of the reign of COVID-19 in our world, Peter, along with most passionate Jewish men, were crying out for the end of Roman occupation, tyranny and corruption. It seems that Peter is actually defining the somewhat ambiguous term Messiah to reflect his agenda, his desires, his hopes, dreams, and aspirations. Historians record numerous unsuccessful uprisings around the time of Jesus. It isn't hard to imagine that people, just like Peter, were longing for an anointed one, the one who would finally put it right. Peter's claim, "You are the Messiah," is actually an astounding statement. So far in Mark's Gospel, Jesus hasn't done anything that looks particularly Messiah-like. A few Jewish texts that mention the Messiah paint a very different picture. This means Peter's comment is anticipatory. Peter cannot be saying, "The stuff you're doing, Jesus, reminds me of those obscure references we find in some writings about a uniquely anointed, divinely authorized deliverer." No, by calling Jesus the Messiah, at this point in the story, Peter declares, "I think that you're the one who will purify our society, re-establish Israel's supremacy among the nations, and usher in a new era of peace and holiness. This is what I'm expecting you to do, Jesus." Jesus' command for secrecy seems to be, in a way, an acceptance of the title. But Jesus then goes on to explain what the title actually means, which Peter just cannot accept. "Jesus, that's not what I meant," I can hear Peter saying. Peter does cop a fair bit of criticism throughout the Gospels as the one who's constantly getting it wrong and in need of correction. But I think he is absolutely relatable to me, and I suspect to all of us. And we can find comfort in the fact that it is people like Peter, you and me, on which Jesus builds his church. Like Peter, when we want God's intervention in our world, it is almost always to put things right in terms of how we see them. Surely they won't elect him again. How can people be so stupid? Why can't we have things back to the way that they used to be? I don't think it should be this way at all. Peter is defining Messiah in terms of his will, his agenda, his hopes and desires. The psalmist does say, "Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." I do think it is important to reveal to God in prayer and in worship, in lament and supplication, our agendas, our hopes, and our desires. But I think that doing it in prayer and in worship does help redeem and transform those agendas, hopes, and desires into kingdom agendas, hopes, and desires, rather than the personal agendas, hopes, and desires they often start as. Jesus says to us today, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." The Messiah, Jesus, is the one who we follow, whose ways are not our ways, whose thoughts are not our thoughts. If our agendas, hopes, and desires can't be transformed into kingdom agendas or consistent with kingdom agendas, we're called to deny them, to lay them down, and to follow the Messiah and take up his cause. The life, work, mission, death, and resurrection of Jesus become the comprehensive definition of what was previously an obscure term that was co-opted to serve a personal agenda. If we were in Peter's shoes, or sandals most likely, we too would have wanted a Messiah to fix the problems that we saw and would have expected them to get to work doing it. Peter would not have chosen the path that Jesus took, and neither would we. We probably would have tried to rebuke Jesus too. But Jesus took that path for Peter and for each of us. So in response, we are called to follow Jesus, Messiah. Simply is Jesus who we follow into unexpected situations for selfless causes, for the benefit of others and for the glory of God. Jesus is the anointed one, the one. If we let the one lead us, if we follow, we will not end up where we thought we wanted to go, but we will be where we are called to be, where we are created to be, where we are in a position to be the most impactful and effective. To follow the Messiah is to drop our agenda and take up his, to allow our agendas, hopes, and desires to be transformed into kingdom agendas. I pray we have the humility to do just that. Will you believe that Jesus is the Messiah? And will you follow? Amen.